We now switch to German and welcome our guests to our round. We are delighted to welcome 3 guests for a direct exchange with us on the topic of the conference. From Dresden, we have the Saxonian State Minister of Regional Development, Thomas Schmidt. Good morning, Minister. Good morning and greetings to Leipzig. Good morning. And here in Leipzig, we welcome Professor Silke Weidner here in our round. Professor Weidner was at the forefront when it came to developing the Leipzig Charter, which we'll also refer to a little bit later. Good morning, Mrs. Weidner. Good morning. And also connected remote is Professor Georg Teutsch. He is the scientific manager of the Helmholtz Center for Environmental Research. And so he is more or less the host of our conference site. Welcome, Mr. Teutsch. Good morning, and a very warm welcome. Over the next 45 minutes, we would like to talk with you about the contribution of politics, cities, and science when it comes to sustainable and resilient urban-rural partnerships. Mr. State Minister, please allow me to ask you the first question. From 2014 until 2019, you were responsible for environment and agriculture. And since the end of 2019, you have been responsible for regional development in the new ministry in Saxony. It's a new ministry, and this may also be a signal that regional focus is becoming increasingly important. How do you assess the topic of this conference? What do you think is the importance of urban-rural relations, and what is the task of your ministry in this context? Well, first of all, thank you for the invitation. The topic of the conference mirrors the tasks of our ministry to a large extent, because isolated view of support of the development of urban-rural spaces, an isolated view and isolated from rural developments, I would say, has been a wrong approach over many years, because first of all, if you want to develop certain spaces in an isolated way, you first have to define what is an urban or rural space. So from Berlin's perspective or Hamburg's perspective, a city with 40,000 to 50,000 inhabitants is rural space, but tell this to people in Freiburg who consider themselves to be completely different. And this is the way how support programs are designed. The European support for rural development starts with cities or towns of less than 2,000 inhabitants. But from the perspective of large cities, the medium and small city with 10 or 20,000 inhabitants is also rural area. And so this overarching view of urban-rural partnerships and of a joint development of urban and rural spaces is a completely right approach. We chose this approach in the new ministry that addresses both rural and urban development and all this cooperation, specifically here in Saxony, in these coal districts where we are also faced with structural change. Then we have housing and listed buildings and urban planning, surveying, and all this is concentrated here. So it's a completely new approach, and we talk about vital regions when it comes to development. So we want to get away from an isolated view of rural or urban spaces. We want to develop vital regions, and the underlying principle is what we call an innovation-based regional development. So we need new ideas and new approaches to replace former thinking, and we need innovation, and no matter whether it's economically or socially and whether it's regional development, this is the only way to achieve real change And we strongly rely, we have always been relying, and this was also my task when I was Minister of Agriculture, we strongly rely on involving people in the regions who develop their own ideas, and we give them considerable freedom when it comes to development. The European support of rural developments that we get, and we have the so-called LEADER principle, and Saxony has developed this much more than any other European regions. So the regions that found themselves, we have 30 regions in Saxony. It has nothing to do with administrative borders. It is orientated towards regional characteristics. They developed their own strategies, which we then approved. And over the past 7 years, they can decide on their own what they will support. And support rates and levels can also be defined there. And that was initially seen very critically in Brussels. Today, because it would open the door for abuse, but the opposite occurred. The people who meet in the bodies and who determine the subsidy and support rates, they had a very responsible approach towards using funds. Funds were even decreased by 10% because we have a limited amount of funds and you must be very responsible in applying these funds. And we have already become some kind of benchmark, and we are a positive example. We were courageous, we trust in the Union, and at the end of the day, it turned out to be successful, and we are determined to develop this further in the new ministry. And urban-rural relations will be used and supported much more than ever before. As Mayor Young also said it very clearly, the city needs the rural area, and the rural area needs the city. So state-of-the-art digitalization possibilities, smart transport systems can be created, medical care can be based on a completely different approach, high-tech medicines with rural doctors' offices that can be connected, and new education offerings can be developed. The supply systems can also be digitalized. So it's not just the big players in online retail who use it, but this is also an opportunity for the small retailers with direct marketing and selling their goods via online portals, and to reach a completely different group of customers in cities and villages. So they can make use of these opportunities. And for some years now, we launched a future initiative. Professor Teutsch knows it. We call it 7+. And this is also a reason for your event, that we join forces, and plus signifies that we want to create added values together, and we want to involve science, academia, business in order to develop projects. We want to bring people together and create a platform, and exciting ideas come up in that context. And many stakeholders from business and industry support this. Professor Teutsch is one of them. Thank you very much for this. And so these new ideas can be created in this way. So I'm quite optimistic. We should involve people. We should allow ideas to mature rather than setting the standards top down, and this can be the start for a successful cooperation between urban and rural areas. Thank you for this impressive stories and genesis of the development of this important topic and the presentation of the real pioneering function, and for which you are also famous. The last weeks raised the question how this extreme COVID pandemic can be managed, and you too, some will know you were also affected. The question is, the bigger question is this pandemic also an opportunity for us? So, as some kind of wake-up call, or that new ways must be opened as a consequence of this event, so that new ground can be broken. It is, especially for rural areas, it is an enormous opportunity. We saw that quality of living, of course, in rural areas, also during phases of isolation or partial lockdowns and reduction of public life, can be managed much better in the rural area. And if you combine this with the opportunities offered by digitalization in order to develop new models of working, then it's an enormous opportunity, especially for rural areas. And of course, this also relieves cities, the tense housing situation in the cities. And this is definitely an opportunity. If you look at small cities and villages, if you can use vacant living space while at the same time working in the city. So it's an opportunity for entrepreneurs also to say, of course, we have to talk about broadband development. All these topics must be resolved. This must be resolved. And a lot of money was made available for this. And now construction is the bottleneck. And as soon as these issues have been resolved, this is also an opportunity that living, working, and development of business can be rolled out into rural areas, so that the economic damage will not be so bad that we will have to pass a deep valley. We have to be realistic, but once we have crossed this valley, then there's an enormous opportunity, especially when it comes to urban-rural relations, economy, and living conditions, in order to find new ways. Thank you, Mr. Minister, for your explanations. Now the key word: urban-rural development, resilience, and sustainability. Now we have Professor Weidner in our round, because she's at the forefront and she advised the German government in the development of the new Leipzig Charter. And this is the European level at which we are now moving. And the question that we would like to discuss with Silke Weidner is, why do we need a new Leipzig Charter? And what are the key issues which will also consider the topic of our conference? Well, thank you. And before we go to the concrete questions and maybe also discuss with the others, I would like to present the basics of the Charter so we all know what we are talking about. Sigrun Kabisch said that I had a major share in the development, but I'm just one of a larger group. I represent the Brandenburg Technical University at Cottbus. We were mainly responsible for the scientific part and for the fundamental study that underlies this, but also the dialogue process. And ultimately, in the development of this charter, the other partners are the German association EUKN. And over the past 2 years, we intensively worked with the other partners, the Federal Ministry of the Interior. The new Leipzig Charter, I would say, it's a child of its days. Many terms were mentioned: resilience, divide between urban and rural areas. And this is also where it belongs to. And these are the headlines that structure the charter. This 12-page charter, it's a little longer than the old one, and this shows this quite well. The charter consists of 4 main modules. One is the preamble, more about this later. Then the description and the setting, I would call it, of the transformative power of European cities as an urban model. Then the key principles and the working principle for good urban governance. And ultimately, one chapter on how cities, which are also challenged and supported here, how these can be strengthened and empowered. The question Linkages asks, so why? So what are the reasons for a new charter or charter reloaded or updated? So it's quite easy to answer, and some of these points were already mentioned before. On the one hand, we have completely different framework conditions in terms of topics. We have different challenges. You can see them here on the slide. Climate protection is one of them, resource protection, migration, and many other topics. And on the other hand, compared to 2007, when the first charter was written, we have completely different political and strategic documents that outline and address this. Remember, in 2007, the Leipzig Charter was one of the first international European document that addressed the topic of urban development. Now we have the new urban agenda, the SDGs, the Green Deal, so many things which already address these topics. And now, how does this charter look? I show you this diagram here, maybe just briefly with its heading here. The new Leipzig Charter, the transformative power of cities for the common good. This already set the goals. The common good is the top priority, as we see it here on the slides, for the working principles. It is orientation towards the common good, and the Charter, compared to 2007, for all the urban and regional planning statement, it has a much stronger social focus, and it sets different core topics. First, it was integrated urban developments with guidance for the European Union, the federal government and municipalities, and the disadvantaged quarters. Now it's the common good and other topics that are connected to this and that address this. Other core principles have become important. Let me mention just one, because the minister also said this. The co-production also has an important role to play here. So common action of stakeholders who are involved in processes where otherwise the political elite would have acted on its own. And you can see, and in the future also read many others, on Monday the charter will be signed by the ministers, unfortunately only online, otherwise it would have been in Leipzig, but you can then also read all this. But just briefly, in order to refer to the conference, the three topics or dimensions covered by the charter: fair and productive, and it addresses a fourth dimension. This is digitalization as a cross-cutting topic for all the other topics, critically seen, but it also offers opportunities, and it focuses on three spatial areas: the quarter, the city as a whole, and that's new, and I think that's very important for today, the functional area. So this is the urban-rural relationship that's new in the charter, and this is also connected to a stronger focus on smaller cities. The old charter focused more on large cities, even though the authors had a different view, but that was the feedback, and now this has changed. But at this point, I would like to stop, and I would also like to answer further questions. Well, thank you very much for this statement. You said that it's very important to achieve a broad participation, and the minister also mentioned this. So how specific is this? How can we imagine this? We have citizens, we have municipalities, we have academia. How can all these stakeholders participate? If I can show you another diagram, over 2.5 years, if you look at the core process, we had a very intensive dialogue process. We had 12 meetings, 16 in the European framework, and during these meetings, we had representatives of stakeholders. Otherwise, it would have been impossible to manage this, who voiced their opinions, who contributed also their knowledge and their views. Just let me mention a few at a national level. We have representatives from academia as project partners, from municipalities, also from smaller cities, deliberately from regional associations, the German City Association, the German Industry and Chamber of Industry and Commerce, and many stakeholder organizations who focused their opinions and contributed this. In this way, we could gather positions, cluster them, coordinate them in order to jointly set priorities. Because I mentioned the 12 pages deliberately, we planned to reduce it to 8 pages, but given the large number of topics, it was not possible. At a European level, that could also be mentioned, we had representatives from European Parliament, Commission, and from scientific institutions from Europe, the OECD, the European Committee of Regions, representatives of the urban agenda from the partnerships that exist, or multi-level governance approaches, and so forth. So many stakeholders were involved, and that was very fruitful, I must say. Well, thank you. And this shows how intensive the different levels at which all this was discussed. And from my side, I would also like to thank you very much. We now come to our third participant in this round, Professor Georg Teutsch, who is also connected here.
Mr. Teutsch, we are delighted that you're here with us as a director of the Helmholtz Environmental Research Center. We've already heard about excellent research from Minister Karliczek, and Mayor Jung already underlined the good relationship between the city of Leipzig and the Environmental Agency, and State Minister Schmidt also pointed out what the role is that research has. So you are a scientist that has a very interdisciplinary basic. You've got a very good overview on research and innovation. And this holds true for our host site today, the UFZ, the Environmental Agency. So what is the importance of urban-rural linkages, maybe from your personal viewpoint as an interdisciplinary scientist, but also when you look at the research projects that are carried out here at the Institute? First of all, thank you very much. Do you hear me well enough? Great. Well, you've already mentioned it, so did the other speakers. Urban-rural linkages. So basically, we don't really make a distinction because we're talking about complex relationships. I don't need to mention them again: climate neutrality, energy supply. We have to switch to renewable energy sources, be resource efficient. And at the same time, we want to increase the quality of living. We want to live well, and for that we require an income and we need to create value. Otherwise, we won't be able to implement it. And bringing all these aspects together is already quite a challenge. And what is crucial is that we link urban, peri-urban, and the surrounding, the rural areas. If you look at the challenges that we are facing because of climate change, biodiversity, water management, forest management, these are various projects in rural areas. And on the other hand, we need to adapt. We need to transform our behavior, mobility, how we live, how we use our resources and energy. So we cannot achieve all these goals if we don't bring these issues and regions together. And here in our institute, we have a very strong scientific foundation, but we also have specialists that look at urban and rural areas. And we also have social scientists, because it only works with human participation. That's why I'd say it's an extremely interesting topic. I could go on forever about all the opportunities we have due to globalization that's already been mentioned. We always say it's going to be difficult, transport lines in rural areas, they're isolated. But let's imagine, let's look ahead for 10 or 15 years, maybe autonomous transport maybe small-scale units and vehicles that are driving around with electricity, of course. At times we want, and maybe some few buses, some few trains that will only run 3 or 4 times a day. These are many ideas that try to take into account the progress that's being made in a resource-efficient way. And obviously, we need to link it to positive feeling and quality of living. So I do see a lot of opportunities more than risks. And if we look at Germany and Europe, and Saxony in particular, I am optimistic it may be different in other parts of the world. So we need to pay attention to other countries as well. But if we're looking at this conference now, we're talking about a variety of issues: technology, governance, new forms of cooperation. So this is extremely interesting, and I thank you for that. You started as a scientist, of course. You started with the complexity and understanding of systems. And this also is a factor why we have a variety of topics today at the conference. And then you closed the gap and talked about governance and social sciences. That is a very important question. Do we know what we need to do? How do we implement all these goals in our everyday lives? That's why we have a number of questions relevant to the social sciences. You've already hinted at some of them, but maybe you have an interesting hypothesis that we might want to look at in greater depth. Yeah, there's a number of examples. For example, individual behavior. How can we achieve transformation that's not only technical, based on engineering, but how do we live this transformation? How do we adapt? Right now, we're living some kind of revolution, the change in the business environment. Everybody's surprised how we've adapted. Look at ourselves. The minister sits at home, I'm sitting at home, but we're getting together. Of course, this doesn't replace social contacts, of course. All of you who has already spent hours in video conferences knows very well that we also need to spend some time together during the conference break and have a glass of wine. Nevertheless, our world is changing. Systemic crises like COVID-19 also offer opportunities. The role of science is important, and we can see what the role is compared to other countries. Because we need an input from science, and the countries who've listened to the voice of science have managed the crisis better. We can also make a comparison between systems that are more federal or more centralized. There was a discussion yesterday between the chancellor and all the minister presidents that took 7 hours, and maybe it's actually good that it takes 7 hours, because that means we don't have one size fit all approaches, but we have different solutions. And I think in Germany, this works quite well. We can draw comparisons with other countries who were at a similar level when it comes to wealth, but who've managed the crisis less well. So I think science does play a very important role. And if we manage to roll out these vaccines and distribute them in the population, then again, there's a crucial role for research and science and innovation. I do believe that these crises offer opportunities that weren't there before. Minister Schmidt, we'd like to get back to you and ask, what role, what expectations do you have vis-à-vis science and research? What are your actual questions and expectations towards us, the Helmholtz Center for Environmental Research, but also to other colleagues? All these issues and questions you've lined out that you're trying to work on with your ministry, how can we help you in implementing it? Well, we live in a period of many changes. And this change happens at very different levels. Climate change, for example, we've been discussing that for quite a while, and a lot has been implemented. But there's also change in the economy, in society. If we look at the global level, there are changes in all kinds of regions. It's different from what happens maybe in Europe or in Africa. There are huge differences. Transformation in Asia is still different. So if we break it down from the global to the European and then to the local level, then we need a scientific and research foundation. It's essential. For me, it's extremely important that we allow open processes for this. Policymakers have a tendency, and obviously I'm part of that, so I'm critical myself. There is a tendency to formulate goals and frameworks, and that of course is important. Frameworks are important, and they should also be valid for a while and not be renewed too much. But in the meantime, you need some freedom for research and innovation. Policymakers shouldn't dictate all the paths along which research has to happen, but there needs to be some freedom and space for new technologies, procedures in science and in the economy. We don't know what possibilities we'll have in 3, 4, or 5 years. We don't know it yet. And, you know, one example could be energy transition. So policymakers shouldn't determine the paths. It should be up to science and research to open up new possibilities and find the best solution. In my view, it's important to give freedom to science and research, but we also can have expectations that they will take up these challenges and accompany our considerations and processes. And I'm very happy that we had quite a priority in Saxony in the late 90s, early 2000s on research and innovation. There was a lot of criticism back then, but we really shaped a research landscape. Universities, research institutes, business research institutes, that's a characteristic in Saxony as well. So we have to look at how can we go across different disciplines in science? How can we go and think beyond these boundaries between science, between business, between academia? This is side of politics. We need to be done with that. We have to move away from clear and narrow target groups, but we need to focus on goals, not target groups. And then we'll enter an open process of innovation, which will deliver incredible things. I already talked about City and Rural Plus. And as I would like to say, we need to organize spontaneous events and synergies. We need to bring together different goals. Now we're talking about urban-rural linkages, and I think it'll deliver amazing results. So as I said, policymakers need to formulate clear goals and set frameworks, but it's up to science, businesses, society at large to fill in this space. And that needs to be a free space with open possibilities in which paths can be found. Thank you so much. Let's have a look at the feed. So we're looking what questions you've asked in the chat. One of the questions actually fits quite well to what Mr. Schmidt has just said. A researcher from the socio-ecological area asks for structured pathways that can include research and science into policymaking directly. So Minister Schmidt has already been quite clear on what position he has, but I'd like to bring Mr. Teutsch back in due to his long experience with the translation of social science or science research into policymaking. How do we get these results from science into policymaking? That question of a paramount importance. Because on the one hand, there's a certain duty for scientists to deliver. And I believe also somebody who is engaged in foundational research, also such a scientist can be asked, how is it useful for society? And I think it's the duty of policymakers to take these results as a starting point. The whole system only works, and that's an example that we're living here at the Institute. We're saying, let's sketch images for the future. We're looking at the systems we want to get to. As Mr. Schmidt has said, we describe the goal. We don't determine how we get there. We say, what do we want? Sustainable future. We want viable cities. We want to be able to deal with extreme events. We want to manage the energy transition. And that's what we describe as goals. But of course, there are different ways of arriving there. And then we discuss these imaginaries for the future. And of course, we need to make sure that these goals are filled with content, that they have solid procedures. And that's the job for scientists. How do we arrive there? What are the costs? What are the economic side effects? That's not our job for scientists. So lining out these imaginaries for the future, this is what we need to do, and we've been quite successful in doing so in the past years. So these are the famous narratives that are guiding us and that can then be translated into concrete policy making. Mrs. Weidner, maybe the next question for you. We have international guests at this international conference, of course. We're trying to look beyond Saxony and Germany. We have a question from a guest from outside of Europe, from a country with a lower income, developing country. So this guest asks, what is the message you're sending out to those countries? What is the added value in urban-rural linkages in those partnerships? So what would you recommend? What contacts have you already had with these countries? Well, I believe it's all the same basic principles that we need for our action. I wouldn't make a distinction between practitioners and scientists. Of course, there are different contexts and different places. You might have different conditions and therefore different results, but the tools and the instruments, they should be the same. So if I get back to the Leipzig Charter, the working principles are the same that we can use. The issues you've already raised, transdisciplinary research, being open to experiments, these are important elements for these countries. So this idea of try and error, trying out what the linkages are, what the interdependencies are, I think that's crucial. If I can mention again the Leipzig Charter, it's moved beyond the European Union. It was signed by the member states of the European Union in 2007, but it's gone further than that. And it's also circulated a lot in Ukraine and South Africa. And of course, there are different questions in these contexts, but these ideas of exchange, of co-production, we can see that in other countries. If I look at Ukraine, for example, it's rather different. There's a lot of activists that are very committed to urban development outside of formal structures. So I think that's my recommendation and my idea. As a scientist or as a citizen, do take part. We're glad that we also have UN Habitat as a main partner in some of the sessions of this conference. UN Habitat has worked a lot on guiding principles, the urban-rural linkages, also in the past year, and they've really set the agenda. And UN Habitat will also present this process in one of the sessions this afternoon, so I think there's more space for discussing these topics. We still have some minutes left for asking questions to our guest. I'd like to take up one more question, and I'd like to ask you for a short answer, and then also the Minister Schmidt. One of the participants has a question. According to her personal experience, there's a lot of tools and mechanisms for participation, for citizen engagement. But recently, have you had some successful examples, some positive surprises, where you said, well, that's new. I tried something new and it's worked extremely well, and this is where we want to continue. Well, this is a bit hard to come up with a good best practice example very spontaneously, but let me point out again, when we talk about participation, and we've seen this in the Leipzig Charter process, it might be different in other countries. Participation has a different status in different countries. But what we should not do is make citizens wait for being invited into participation. No, it's different. Participation needs to be co-productive. So citizens themselves need to start and engage and ask others to later join in, competent authorities, for example. And before you mentioned the target groups, I would say in participation, it's important to keep them in mind. For example, especially young children, youth, these are going to be the ones who will have to deal with the challenges that we're talking about in the future. State Minister, keyword of enlarged context and target groups. So what are positive formats you've had recently? You have already talked about shaping rural development in Saxony with these joint programs that decide on the ground what's being financed. We also launched a competition 3 years ago as part of this future initiative. It was a competition for innovative ideas in rural areas. There were 2 modules. One of them addressed municipalities and associations in rural development, and the second module, which was a bit smaller, addressed everybody, any citizen, individuals, any association or business. And for all of these, for these 2 modules, we awarded 10 grants, or 50 grants, starting from 20,000 euros, but down to 5,000 euros for associations or for individuals. And we got a lot of applications, around 400 submissions. In the end, only 50 of them were awarded the grant. And this obviously is part of a competition, joy and disappointment. Some of the applicants said they'd handed in a submission for the 2nd or 3rd time. Of course, that's a competition. But what these numbers say is that 400 individuals and associations sat together, brainstormed and thought, what can I do here in my region? What momentum can I create? And as I said, we chose 50 winners. But all the others, in the end, some of them did get together, developed ideas and wanted to continue. So even if they didn't get the 5,000 euros, but at least maybe some of these projects were implemented. And to me, this shows that all these applicants come with a very broad spectrum, cultural associations, businesses, individuals. And I think this is encouraging. And it shows how many people are actually motivated and make active efforts and develop new ideas. And I do agree with you, Mrs. Weidner. You said it needs a bottom-up process. We need to motivate people, but develop projects and being involved themselves, that's not something that can be launched from above, ordered from above by the state. That has never worked. It needs to be a bottom-up process. We need to make people enthusiastic, need to encourage them, and this is how we can get anywhere. You know, we need to create a spark of inspiration, enthusiasm, and for this we need trust in the government and the local authorities, and then we can realize many things.
Unfortunately, we come to the end of our discussion round. At the end, we would ask you to complete a sentence, which we begin here, and the sentence is, urban-rural partnerships are successful if. Mr. Minister, could you please begin to complete the sentence? I repeat, urban-rural partnerships are successful if they are accepted and lived by people. Mrs. Weidner, thank you. If the stakeholders in cities and rural areas are aware of their synergies and also competing activities, so if there's great transparency. Mr. Teutsch, please. If science joins in and helps, in fact, to develop realistic and positive ideas for the future. Thank you for these very precise answers to our question or for completing our sentence. We would like to thank you very much for your cooperation. And now, as a token of our gratitude, we would like to give you a book, and this book is House of Europe, European Testimonies in Deutsche Nationalbibliothek. This book is expressly written on the occasion of the German presidency of the European Union. And at this point, we would also like to thank Deutsche Nationalbibliothek, who supported us so strongly for our conference, especially Dr. Jacobs. I would now like to give this book to Mrs. Weidner, and of course the gentleman will also receive one. She will take it as your representative and we will send it to you. The cover of the book shows the Taurus who kidnapped Europe and brought it to a country that had no name. And due to the affection of Joyce to his princess, then gave the name Europe to this country. And now we know how our continent Europe got its name. So once again, thank you very much for your cooperation and participation. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And I wish you further success in your conference. And from my side, I would also like to thank you. We know.
Mr. Minister Schmidt, thanks a lot. Georg Teutsch, thanks a lot. Frau Weidner, vielen Dank.